Hi everyone, this is the first mini lecture segment of the second half of this course. And for the second half of this course, we're going to focus more on hands-on work and with methods and also with data analysis. In this first video, I'm going to be introducing interviews and focus groups and talking about some of the strengths and the weaknesses of each of them. So we'll start with interviews first, and there are different forms of interviews. Usually when we think of an interview, we think of a one-to-one situation, kind of like in this picture here, where one person asks another person questions and then the other person replies. But there are also other types of interviews we can think about, such as paired interviews, and that is when you have like two people participating at the same time. Or in some cases, you might have, for an example, two people who are friends participating, and sometimes this is done because the participants may feel more comfortable when they have someone with them compared to doing it alone. Interviews don't have to only happen in person, they can also be done online or over the phone. So, in the project I was working with on children's experiences during COVID with Rebecca, we actually did the interviews through online video calls. And the reason we chose to do that was because of the social distancing measures that were in place. But there are many other reasons why people may choose to do online video calls, such as a researcher who wants to interview people from a different country. Maybe it makes it possible for them to be able to interview them without having to actually go to that place. It can also be done on the phone, and you can interview someone over the phone and record that as well. Walking interviews are another type of interview where you walk with somebody while you're interviewing them. So some of the interviews that I had done for my master's project on the children's perspectives in their outdoor play space, some of the interviews we did were walking interviews, and I interviewed the children as we walked around the playground, and this gave the children the opportunity to show me things as we were talking about them. And so I guess it structured the interview in some ways. And walking interviews have been used a lot in research that focuses on people's perspectives of things such as their neighborhoods or people's attachments to place. There can be interviews where the researcher and the participant are just walking and chatting, to more structured walking and talking tours, like taking the researcher on a tour of the neighborhood or the researcher taking the participant. You can also do repeat interviews, and we see this in the Frosh reading where they did more than one interview with the participants. This was also the case in the COVID project we did with the children. We did more than one interview, and I think this was important because it gave us a chance to build relationships with the children. And it was interesting because if you listen to the first interview and then you listen to like the fourth, you can see how the children become more comfortable, and you can kind of see how you start to build a relationship with the child, which I think is important in research. So I do kind of like the repeat interviews. We can also talk about closed versus more open interviews. And when we start talking about this, we're talking more about the style of the interview. So a closed interview may look more like a survey type of question. So on this slide, we have an example here. On a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is really disliking and 10 is really liking, how much do you like online schooling? Or what are 3 things you like most about online schooling? And what are 3 things you least like about online schooling? So as you can see, these are pretty closed-ended questions. They don't really give the participant room to elaborate or direct the conversation in another way, or they don't really give them room to talk about anything outside of the question. So they're a little bit limiting, as you can see. The second style is a semi-structured interview. This kind of falls in between the closed interviews and the open interviews. This style is a little bit more flexible, which is kind of nice. And in a semi-structured interview, you have questions that will help you guide the interview and focus in on what you want to study. But at the same time, they also give room for the participants to take a little bit of the lead and take the conversation where they want to go as they answer the questions. So for an example, we have some questions here. What is your favorite sport? Why is that? So this question gives them a little bit more room to explain. Can you tell me what inspired you to play that sport? So this style opens up more possibilities for what the participant can discuss. So the next style we have is open interviews. And in this style, the questions are quite open and rather quite broad. So they provide some freedom for the respondent to kind of take the conversation where they want to go, and it doesn't really restrict them. So here we have a question, and this question actually comes from a researcher who is interested in learning about how childhood experiences shape a person's parenting later in life. So the question asks, what do you remember about your childhood? Or tell me your life story from your childhood until now. As you can see, this question is really open and it really gives space for the participant to kind of go where they want to go as they answer the question. So now let's look at some of the advantages of interviews. So first, they are private, if you can ensure that you can do them in a private space, of course. And they are just 2 people or 3 people if it's paired. It can be an opportunity for the participant to talk about more personal or sensitive topics that may not be possible or seem as comfortable in other types of data collection. Next, they are also an opportunity to go in depth, especially when using the semi-structured style or more open style of interview, because these give space and room for more personal stories. They also give the opportunity for the researcher and the participant to build relationships, especially when doing repeat interviews. They give the researcher a chance to share a bit about themselves, and the researcher and the participant can learn about each other in meaningful ways. So we see this in the Frosch article. For some of the boys, they tended to become quite open about topics they did not normally talk about with other adults. And this happened as they became more familiar with the interviewer, which was also a result of using the repeat interviews. So there are also some disadvantages to doing interviews. And in the Frosch article, we can see that some of the participants are a bit uncomfortable in the individual interviews, and the researcher wonders if this is part of a power imbalance. Because, the boys viewed him as more of an authoritarian figure or possibly a teacher figure, which can impact, the way they react in the interview. This can sometimes happen in interviews when the interviewer is asking all of the questions, and of course there are other things that will impact this, such as the research topic and the researcher's positionality. So this can and has created challenges, especially in research with children. Also, sometimes the researcher can dominate the interview, and this can happen when the interviewer controls a lot of the interview situation or largely shapes the interview. And last, we can finally see discomfort, and this can be because of the power imbalance we just mentioned, but it also can be because of the participant's personality, which we need to keep in mind. Some people just aren't comfortable in the interview situation, and having a one-on-one conversation sitting at a table is just an uncomfortable situation for them. So now we are going to talk about focus groups, which are basically group interviews. We see this in the Frosch article, and they talk about group interviews, but really what they mean is focus groups. So you can have different size groups. You can have either small groups or large groups. Usually a good number is around 5 to 6 participants. However, they can also be small, such as 2 to 3 participants, or large, such as 10 people. Sometimes with large groups, it can be tough or get a little bit chaotic, for an example, though. So in the focus group, there is usually a facilitator, and the facilitator is the person who guides the focus group. They ask the questions, and they also ensure that the participants in the groups take turns speaking while giving the participants room to have conversations with one another as well. These groups can happen in person, but they can also happen online. So, what are some of the advantages of a focus group? Well, one of them is that it can give you an opportunity to see how people talk publicly about certain things. So, if you are interested in this, then a focus group could be a good fit. For an example, if you wanted to learn about how youth in a low-income neighborhood grow up and how this neighborhood impacts their social relationships, you may choose to use the focus group. Focus groups can also be used to build support between participants. So sometimes this has been done on topics that are maybe a bit more sensitive or difficult. So for an example, if you have a group of child carers who have done caregiving for their parents, you could have a focus group with them. And the focus group can kind of act as a way to build and support one another as they hear stories from each other about challenges they are faced with. They can kind of support each other within that group. And they can also be fun. So they can be an opportunity for participants, for an example, to hang out with their friends. And, we kind of saw this in the Frosch article. They can also really shift the power dynamics. So that one-on-one situation with the dominating interviewer can be disrupted in a focus group where there are more participants than the researcher, and the participants can really shape where that focus group goes. And sometimes the participants may feel more comfortable because all the attention isn't focused on them as it would be in an interview one on one. And so, if they're maybe not sure how to answer a question, for an example, there are other people in the group who may be able to answer instead, and that person doesn't feel like they are put on the spot so much. So, there are also some disadvantages to focus groups, and this can be impacted by the way the focus group is run. So, if you have a focus group that is too controlled, which would mean like the interviewer asks each person the same question, for an example, and goes around the group so they all respond to the exact same question individually, it kind of becomes more of a series of individual interviews, and this can be really boring. And it just really means that the interaction between the participants with each other really doesn't happen. And you can miss some really rich conversation that can happen between participants when when they respond to one another or disagree with one another. Those are all important parts that can be missed if you're individually asking people questions within the focus group. However, you can also have a focus group that is really uncontrolled, and the participants completely take the focus group in whatever direction they want. And then the questions that the researcher wanted to address kind of get pushed out of the way, and not all of the topics maybe that they wanted to touch on um, happen within that focus group. So, focus groups can also be tough around confidentiality, and we know from the Frosch article that some of the participants were a bit more uncomfortable talking about certain issues in the focus group. So, it depends on who you are in the focus group, and it also depends on what you like, and it may depend on who you are with in the focus group. So, talking about certain topics may be challenging to do in a focus group. Some people may be uncomfortable in group settings, or they may be uncomfortable talking in groups with more people. Some suggest that group norms can also be a bit tricky. So if someone talks about something in the group and the other participants may find it hard to disagree with that person, then that can kind of be a problem. Or if everyone in the group is saying one thing and one participant actually disagrees with that, they may find it hard to speak up and say that they disagree. So that's the end of our first segment video for this lesson, and I hope you enjoyed learning about focus groups and interviews. And next, we are going to learn about how you choose which one you would like to use as a method in your research.